Three people in there. All right. So, Arjuna, thanks for coming on, being able to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Yeah, sure. So I live in New Zealand. I was born here, moved to Canada when I was 8. So I essentially grew up there, moved back to New Zealand when I was 19. When I was like 11, we started going to church a lot, was a Christian. Then when I was 16, kind of philosophical issues with Christianity cropped up. And I always believed in God my entire life, but I lost interest in Christianity and sort of became eclectic, thinking I could piece together from different religions and get different valuable pieces here and there. And then when I was 21 back in New Zealand, I met the Harry Krishnas and the philosophy made complete sense to me. So I've been practicing that for like the last 9 years. And I'm married with 2 kids, been married for like 7 years now.
Cool.
4-year-old and 1-year-old boy. They're real hard work, but it's worth it.
Congratulations. My condolences to your social life. So what is it about Harry Krishna that you think makes more sense than Christianity?
I can't remember what the thought process was at the time when I was 16, but I was reading Socrates and stuff like that, and questions come up. Like, I mean, I think a lot of atheists do a good job of poking fun at Christianity and finding issues with it. And I agree with many of those same criticisms, and I find Krishna consciousness can resolve many of them. Like this idea that you need someone to die on a cross in order to pay for your sins is a bit odd. You know, if God's the boss, then surely he can just say, you know what, we're good. You know, you just behave well from here on out and we'll forget about the past. I don't see. Yeah.
So does Hare Krishna have a similar kind of sin thing where you were forgiven for our sins for something we do, or some kind of condition that it has to meet? And how is that different from dying on the cross?
Salvation isn't like a thing where, you know, there was a play that the Hare Krishnas used to do called Tab It to Jesus. So, you know, whatever sins you did, you just like, oh, just charge Jesus for that one. And this idea is kind of incoherent to us because, you know, we see like the kind of salvation that is offered by Krishna and Bhagavad Gita. It's nothing like sectarian religion, and it's not like bureaucratic. It's like you could compare it to like the success principles of having a healthy marriage. You know, like you could, yeah, like at the end of Krishna gives all these instructions, and then at the end he's like, you know, I've told you everything. Now you decide what you want to do. And you know, you could go to a counselor, and they could be like, it could be something similar, like, you know, I've told you all these ways you can fix your marriage. Now you decide what you want to do. Like you're ultimately the one that's going to suffer based on what you do and what you don't do. So there's kind of, it's almost like yoga psychology. Like there's just laws about the way the world works, and you can position yourself in such a way that you elevate yourself or you can degrade yourself. And it's not sectarian. Anyone who's following those principles, even if they don't believe in God, will be elevating. And if they get elevated enough, then they'll come to be aware of God's existence and come closer to him.
How is that different from Christianity? Because Christianity makes similar claims that if you just pray hard enough or whatever, pray genuinely enough, you'll get to know God in some way. And if we like just look at different societies in the world, the Hare Krishnas don't seem to be like the richest or the smartest or the most enlightened. There seems to be lots of other groups we could measure on any criteria that seem to be doing better than Hare Krishna. So what is the reasoning to believe that the laws handed down by Hare Krishna are actually true, as opposed to just like Christianity, just made up?
Can you say the first part again? Sorry.
Yeah, so it seems like the laws that you mentioned in the Bhagavad Gita, where it gives us to like live your life this way, if you live the correct way, you'll get to know God. You said something like that. If you like live in the correct way, I don't remember your exact phrasing, but the same thing seems to apply to Christianity. If you pray to Jesus and you open your heart to God, blah 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 blah.
Right. So, I mean, that made me think of one thing that I thought of when I was hearing you on the empathetic atheist, and it's something I've thought about a bit, which is there's this idea in a lot of religious groups about we call it prosperity doctrine or prosperity gospel, that if you're religious, it means you'll be materially successful, or, you know, God will fix your material problems, and you can measure somebody's God consciousness by their bank account and their health. And would you agree that's a common idea among religious people?
Not really. It's kind of a fringe movement under Christianity. The prosperity gospel is seen as a joke by most Christians, but even if we,
I think it's actually the fastest growing though. Like if you look at Hillsong, they pack out a stadium every week. Well, maybe not at the moment.
so do Mormons. I don't really consider Mormons to be fast growing. I mean, I think the fastest growing religion is Falun Gong right now. But
I mean, of the Christians, the fastest growing are the ones that say, join our church and you'll be rich.
I don't think so. I'm pretty sure the fastest growing is the leftist, left-leaning part of the church that accepts homosexuality. That's the fastest growing branch of Christianity right now. People are leaving the right side of Protestant and Catholicism who reject homosexuality and other kinds of things they see as debaucherous, and then the left side, which accepts them as not wholly immoral, is actually the one that's growing the most, from my understanding. But that's beside the point. So, but yeah, anyway, my initial point is that, But my initial point is that even if we get rid of the prosperity gospel, I don't care about the material wealth side. I just care about any measurable effect. It seems like if you say that living your life a certain way is going to have some kind of a beneficial effect, like getting to know God or something, we should be able to see some kind of a difference. Otherwise, why should we believe that it's actually doing anything? Like, what is...
Yeah, so the difference you see, like it's measured with social science. I'm not super expert in all the research behind it, but they do find that people who are religious are happier, healthier, and live longer. And like there's one verse in the Bhagavatam, which is one of our core scriptures, that says, for one who's advancing in God consciousness, it compares it to having a meal. So when someone's engaged in eating a healthy meal, three things happen simultaneously. They experience pleasure, their hunger goes away, and they get nourishment, they get energy. So in a similar way, someone who's advancing in God consciousness, they become detached from the material world. I think that's a pretty universal idea that if someone's religious, they shouldn't be like trying to keep up with the Joneses excessively, maxing out all their credit cards so they can get a fancier car. And, that there should be some detachment from these sort of worldly things, as they'll be getting their happiness somewhere else. They get a kind of bliss, a special kind of bliss, it's called, what's the word in the bhakti. They experience devotion for God, and they get a direct perception of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And of course,
we can't test that one, unfortunately. That's not testable.
You can't test that one, no.
But the other ones you mentioned, we can test, like all the different benefits. Those are all measured based on societal impact. So if you're in a group that is religious and you happen to share the religion, then there is a benefit. But the opposite is the case if you're in a group that is non-religious. If, for example, in secular countries, if you're a part of the religion, you don't see the same benefits. And you actually see the benefits if you share whatever ideology they have. So, for example, if you're in Iceland, Sweden, Denmark, whatever. Actually, Iceland, I think, is majority Christian. But any of the other countries, as long as you're a liberal, you have all of those benefits. But if you're a Republican, no, people hate you. So you don't get those benefits. So it seems like, based on all the social science studies, those benefits are simply agreeing with or sharing the ideology of the community. And if you do that, then you gain all of the emotional benefits, and has nothing to do with the actual belief itself. It's just as long as you mix in with the community and you can share a social life, though the social life is what gives you those benefits, not necessarily the belief system. So it seems like, based on social science, it's not actually religious belief that does that. It's just social acceptance.
The exception to that would be hermits. So if you find someone who they're happy in a group of people, and if you put them completely on their own, they've still got the same kind of happiness.
Sure. But there's definitely examples like that too in the secular community, like Stoics, who say you shouldn't get attached to the material world and you should just be accepting of the way things are. And there's several others. I don't really know them off the top of my head, but I know a few friends who do. Who are kind of obsessed with it, ironically. But there's lots of those examples even in secular communities that praise detachment from material things and have comfort in solitude. So I will also say that wouldn't be unique among religious people either.
I tried having this discussion with Aaron Ra, and he just wouldn't have this kind of conversation.
You're a liar. Evolution.
Yeah. I don't think he's the best on the philosophy front. Yeah, he's a really good rhetorician. So it's nice to actually be having a conversation about this stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, I do think it's a fair point to say that that kind of inner satisfaction could just be a result of being accepted by a community. Uh, and then your point about hermits who are non-theistic, we could still maybe chalk that up to universal principles, like there is, an ascetic lifestyle. Like Jordan Peterson talks a lot about how you find happiness when you're not looking for it, and when you're actually looking for meaning. There's actually a deeper level of happiness, it's like, we think we want like peace and satisfaction and pleasure, all that, but what we really want is meaning. And there can be a deeper meaning, that can be a deeper level of satisfaction to be, living that kind of ascetic life where you're not chasing after sense gratification, you're trying to do something meaningful. One point that's raised in our theology a lot is service. So the spirit soul is eternally serving. Even if we don't want to be doing service, we still end up doing service. You want to make money, you have to go and work for an employer, and you end up serving other people to pay your bills. No matter what you do, you're serving somebody.
Not really. I mean, I don't know who the casinos are serving. They're mostly not serving people. They're more like this. They're taking people's money.
They're serving people's desire to go and have a fun time with a dopamine rush at the casino.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that, I forget what you said. Right. What was it you said right before that?
Kind of going off on a tangent. The deeper satisfaction that these ascetics can find, meaning. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, that's only true for a certain subset of people. Like, you can make generalizations about most human people based on evolution and what gives most people meaning, but many people do not find meaning from especially serving others. Like many people are like psychopaths, narcissists, people with high function autism who only have like a specific special interest. That's everything that matters to them. It can just be trains or whatever, just any random thing. So meaning seems to be purely a biological state of the mind. And if you mess with it, you can get it to be essentially anything you want it to be, or almost. As soon as we get the technology, then we can do that. But it doesn't seem to be meaning that gives us that. Meaning is just a synonym for happiness, as far as I can tell.
Where are those people getting their happiness?
Anything. Like, you can literally get it from anything. So some people are obsessed with cars, some people are obsessed with trains, some people are obsessed with helping others, and some people are obsessed with self-gratification, some sex, some money, some who only get satisfaction from material things and not human interaction. So you can just, anything that exists in the human world is usually a thing that someone gets happiness from.
Like people with Asperger's, which is mild autism, for them, the truth is really important. And they don't care about offending people. They care about defending the truth. So they get meaning from, sharing the truth, so they get obsessed with trains, or they get obsessed with ports. Like one Asperger's kid crucified his teacher in class for getting a detail wrong, saying, it was something like Russia doesn't have a port that can accept large ships.
Russia has three ports.
I mean, this might have, I don't know the details. I'm getting all the details wrong from this example. It was something like this. And he's like, no, that's wrong. There's 2 times of the year where, because of the tides or the weather or whatever, their port has deeper water and they can accept big ships. And it's like, they had this fury that the teacher could possibly be standing in front of the classroom teaching and you have a detail wrong, like how irresponsible it is to call yourself a teacher and get something wrong like that. It's just this tiny little detail. Like, it doesn't really matter. But for somebody with Asperger's, it's like, no, getting the truth right is really important. So,
well, it's not necessarily the truth. It's just whatever your special interest is. So many people with Asperger's have special interests that are not true, like UFOs, Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster. Like, your special interest can be anything, true or false, even religion, Christianity or whatever. So it's not necessarily truth. It's just the facts surrounding your particular special interest. And it's an obsession with that and the relation between those things. So it's not truth that they're obsessed with, just whatever it is they are interested in.
I haven't really thought about it through this much. Usually I try to have this conversation with some atheists and I never get this far. They usually just like have allergic reactions to talking about epistemology. Like taking the psychopath example, like, does somebody's pathology make, a philosophical assessment of the average person invalid?
No.
So I guess we can rule that one out then.
Well, I'm
And
not
like, let's
sure.
say,
It depends on what your point is. Like, if you're just saying the average person finds meaning in human interaction, well, obviously, but I don't think why would that be evidence of
well,
the Hari Krishna doctrines? That just seems to be evidence of evolution and social psychology.
well, the point would just be referring to the soul. So the soul enters the body, and based on that body, so like the body is like a glove. You know, the glove is shaped the same way the hand is. That that's why it has that shape. So the soul has
You're saying
senses and so on.
the soul shapes the body?
The abilities of the body are plug into the abilities of the soul. So because the soul can see, hear, and touch and smell, the body can do all that too. The glove can't give you any ability you don't already have. It's just like a covering that alters your abilities.
So the body is the glove and the soul is the hand in this analogy?
Yeah.
Okay, so did you say all living things have souls by your definition?
Yeah,
okay.
everything. So, you could take birth as a human in your next life, or as a dog, or as a sunflower, or
Okay, so what would, like, if we could do the physical, does the glove, you said the glove can't give new abilities to the hand. So if we could change something in the brain to essentially give a new ability, would that decrease your confidence in your belief system that the body is the glove and not the hand itself?
Well, I mean, in one sense, it's kind of unfalsifiable because you could just say, oh, the soul always had that ability. I'm not sure what ability you'd think of. Like, I mean, if you could introduce like a sixth sense that we can't conceive of because we've never experienced it, then you just push the theology back. But, an idea being unfalsifiable doesn't prove it wrong. It just means we have
no way to
don't have a reason
differentiate
to believe
whether
in
it's
it. Yeah. With it, yeah.
So, but my question would be more specific examples. Like, for example, if we can the glove cut a finger off more or less? Like, so for example, we have examples of essentially every aspect of human decision making. We know it's a part of the brain, that if we damage this part of the brain, you lose, like for desires. We know desires are a part of the brain. There was a person who had was a pedophile essentially, but he was ruled innocent because he had a brain tumor. And when they removed the brain tumor, he no longer had the desires. The brain tumor grew back. He regained the desires. They removed again, lost the desires. He had zero culpability because all those desires were caused by the brain tumor, and he wasn't culpable. So in that case, would you say, was that something to do with the hand or the glove?
That's to do with the glove. So the soul by nature is pure, but we have rebellious desires, or we want to enjoy separate from God or whatever it is. So we get given an opportunity to explore our desires down here, and in order to do that, we get covered over. Because it's like, if maybe we're getting into lots of theological details, if there was no real alternative to having a relationship with God, then it wouldn't be a choice. It wouldn't be free will. And if it's not free will, then the relationship has no meaning. So we're given this opportunity, and to do that, we need to be given a particular body, which allows us to forget God. So the body reduces our abilities, and it alters it too. Like, I can take a light and I can put different diffusers over it, or gels to produce a different color from that light. That doesn't mean that the lampshade is producing the light just because tinkering with the lampshade tinkers with the light. It's just a filter over something that's already there.
Okay, so let's go with a different example. We know choice is also impacted by the brain. For example, Phineas Gage, he had a metal rod shot through his head. And before that, he was just a normal human being. But after that, he lost his ability to control his inhibitions, his impulse control. So anything he had a desire to do, he then did. But that also seems to be not his fault, because it was also a part of his brain. Like, literally, he lost the part of his brain that could give him the ability to make choices or to stop himself from doing things. Would that, in your position, also be the glove or the hand?
Well, that's obviously the glove. I mean, like, I could be driving my car and, something goes wrong with the car and then it can't drive anymore and I'm stuck on the side of the road. Or, the thing won't shift into fifth gear, so I can no longer go 100 kilometers an hour. Or if I do, I'm risking frying my engine because it's revving so high.
Okay, so some more examples. Like we know that morality is also a part of the brain. Morality, empathy, compassion, understanding, all of those can be lost due to brain damage and cause someone to become a psychopath. Those also hand or glove.
Well, if like anything that can be manipulated by tinkering with the brain would be glove.
Well, this is kind of my point, is that I don't know of anything that can't. Like every single example, motivation, ambition, goals, all of those can be shut off. We have examples. Emotions can be shut off. You lose the ability to make any decision at all. Religious belief can be shut off or added on, like in epilepsy. We know that if the corpus callosum is damaged, you can actually have two independent personalities grow in the brain, one that's just religious, one that's an atheist. I don't know, how does that work in your worldview? Is that, which one, are those both the glove?
I mean, you're giving lots of bizarre examples here. So we have this idea of karma. So based on what people have done in previous lives and in this life, they get karma, and that karma it's severe bad karma to have a problem with your brain, because that really messes your life up. So
Oh, sure, but
you would
I
just
would,
say
I'm leaning
these
into,
people have bad karma.
well, I'm leaning into something more specific here. It seems that every single one of our emotions, desires, proclivities, motivations, religious beliefs, is all determined by the brain. So it's not just like, for example, taking a psychopath who is born a psychopath, we see them as being, well, they have free will, like you mentioned earlier. So they're culpable for their actions. But really, as soon as we gain enough technological advancement in the field of neurology, we're going to discover a cure for psychopathy where we can give them a pill and then they will regain their empathetic emotions and be able to say, oh, wow, I can't believe I did all those things. And I was so selfish and evil, and I didn't, and it was so evil of me to do those things. And they realize how it was wrong, which means it wasn't actually their fault. There was no free will there. They're a victim of their psychology equally as much as the brain tumor guy. Like they have no responsibility at all for any of those things. So as far as I can tell, there isn't any part of the brain that isn't just a part of the brain. So it seems like that, given your example of this distinction between the glove and the hand, it's all just the glove. I don't see anywhere that there is this separate hand thing there.
Again, we're going to come to the unfalsifiable problem here, but it's demonstrating a mechanism which achieves a particular result isn't proof that that mechanism doesn't have a teleology behind it, that there's no reason why it's there based on karma or free will or the intention of God. So all these mechanisms, like, people say, oh, we've done away, I think what you're getting at is probably a similar argument to the idea that we've done away with the idea that there's any God controlling the weather with atmospheric physics. Would you agree? We know nobody's controlling the weather because we know that heat differentials and pressure differentials and
yeah, we can't
so
prove it with absolute
causes
certainty, but yes, we know with as high as level of certainty as we can have that it's not being controlled. Yes.
So would you say that's kind of similar to your point with the brain?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, it's essentially, we know that every part of the brain is determined by physical processes, and there's no reason to believe we don't know of a function that isn't determined by physical processes.
I mean, I've not come up to these objections you're raising before, which is to your credit, so I don't have ready answers for them. But like, there is research that suggests that, I mean, first of all, there's the philosophical problem that consciousness cannot conceivably be explained by reducing it to matter.
As far as I know, the consensus in neurology, cognitive science, philosophy of mind, every field of the mind rejects that as a plausible argument. It's just a composition division fallacy saying consciousness cannot come from non-consciousness, which is the same as saying walls cannot come from non-walls. But we know no brick is a wall, and if you add enough bricks together, well, you get a wall. So there's no actual evidence that you can't get consciousness from non-consciousness in any way, or that it's not reducible. It's just our experience of consciousness is not reducible, just like a sound isn't reducible to a CD. You can't like hold up a CD and shake it and sound falls out. Obviously not. But if you put the CD into a CD player, then it reads it in a certain way to produce sound. So consciousness itself is a product of the brain, but it's not going to be, you're not going to just look at the material and see consciousness, just like you're not going to look at a CD and hear the sound.
I don't think that argument works though. Like with a wall, you can look at the chemical substructure of the wall and you can understand the causal relationship between the subcomponents and the final result, the qualities that the wall has. Like, glass, we understand based on the chemical substructure of glass why it's fragile and why it's sharp when it's broken. And carpet, there's a certain shape the fibers take which makes it springy. And so many other examples can be given. Like water, you look at it, you can understand why it's fluid and why it freezes. There's a direct relationship between the chemical components and the result you get at the macro level.
All right, that's why I use the CD example. Like in the CD case, if you're just looking at a CD, no amount of analyzing the molecular structure of the CD is ever going to give you the sound. Like you have to have the correct reading apparatus to look at the CD, read it in such a way to produce the sound. Consciousness is the same thing. Consciousness is a result of the brain reading these signals in such a way to produce this secondary effect, this emergent property, like sound in a CD. So obviously, just looking at the CD, you're never going to know. Like if I just handed it to someone from a different planet, they're never going to figure out what it's going to do. Like it's just a bunch of little blips on a piece of plastic. Like we have no idea what this is. They would need to have the reading apparatus in addition to the CD itself to know what it does. Just looking at the CD, you're never going to discover it. So the same thing would apply to the brain. It's the reason we can't know exactly how it does that is because we don't have the reading apparatus yet. We don't know how the brain works to such a degree that it can realize what the conscious brain is doing. But we are definitely getting closer. Like, for example, recent studies on brains, we've been able to show monkeys like images of things, kill them, cut their brain open, and put their brain on a radioactive sheet of paper, and we see the image that they are looking at. So we are getting closer, and we can predict what people are going to choose before they choose it. So, for example, looking at an fMRI, we can see someone's brain, say pick A or B or whatever, and the neurologist can be, well, he's going to pick B and get it right with a reasonable level of success and know what they're going to pick just by looking at their brain before the person knows what they're going to pick. So it seems like we are actually being able to do exactly that, where we are reducing consciousness to the physical so we can actually see what it's doing, even though we can't, again, it's like a CD, we can't read it exactly yet.
There's 2 points there that I'll probably forget the second one, but the first one was the CD. I think we can compare it to, like, those old toys you used to get where you wind it round and it's got those little prongs on it. When the prongs hit the other prongs, it plays a song.
Yep, the little metal thingies. Yep, I know what you're talking about.
Essentially, a CD getting read by a laser and then moving the speaker is a more sophisticated version of the same thing, but mechanically, you can kind of boil it down to the same thing. So you take that little cylinder that's got the metal divots on it, and you can't hear the sound. You turn it and you see those things moving. Still, where's the sound? It's pushing air around. Okay, air is moving back and forth. There's still no sound. Gets to the ear drum, moves the eardrum back and forth, moves the bone in the ear, moves the little hairs that pick up different frequencies. Electrical impulses get fired into the brain and goes through a whole cascade in the brain. Where's the sound? All we have is electrical activity in the brain at this stage. We still don't have sound. There's no conceivable way to get from that to a sound. Or an image is an even weird one because it's there's a half a second delay between the time it takes for your brain to process image and sound. Yet we see and hear image simultaneously.
I don't think it's not a half a second. It's much shorter than that. But yeah,
it's something anyway. But it's like, so is our brain? There's a few hypotheses that they use to try to explain this. One is that the brain is holding the sound, and we're experiencing reality a little bit delayed. Which baseball players have a problem with that because they're like, no, when I see the ball throw and I hear and see at the same time, because they're working within time frames which are far quicker than what you could explain based on the delay and the time it takes for the brain to process image. And also the problem with that is, so if we are interacting with reality faster than we're processing the image, then you don't have free will. So you got to do away with free will on that explanation. I'm not sure what the other explanations are, but in either case, it's a problem. So if there's a consensus saying we don't have a problem for consciousness, I'm not aware of that consensus because the people I listen to say it's pretty well accepted that consciousness is a problem to explain. It's particularly qualia.
Right, the hard problem of consciousness, but that's, again, everyone in every academic field says that's just going to be material. Like, not everyone, but the consensus.
That's their philosophical presupposition.
Well, no, none of it's a presupposition. So it's just a conclusion based on the evidence. For example, in science, if you have two hypotheses, A and B, and you say they're both to explain some phenomenon, what knocked over that cup, for example? I think it's a squirrel. You think it's a rat. And we say, well, if it's a squirrel, we'll see squirrel droppings. If it's a rat, we'll see rat droppings. And we look and we see, oh, it's squirrel droppings. Well, that means it's probably a squirrel. And we can just rule out the rat hypothesis. Now, of course, it's not absolute proof because maybe a rat knocked it over and then the squirrel came by and did some droppings. And so it's just to manipulate us or something. But it's never certain. But if we get enough of those instances where this hypothesis makes testable predictions that are correct and this one doesn't, that is essentially giving us the highest level of certainty we can that this hypothesis is the correct one and this one is the incorrect one. And in neurology, the materialistic one has always given us correct predictions, whereas the dualistic and idealistic one has never given us any, as far as we know. So the consensus in every academic field is that, yeah, the materialist one is right because it gives us the testable predictions, which are correct every single time. But the idealist one has never done so. So there's no difference between that and leprechauns or the Christian God or Jesus rising from the dead. It's just another hypothesis in someone's imagination, but has no actual evidence to support it. Whereas the materialistic one has lots and lots of evidence to support it.
I listened to one of the talks you gave, or one of the other discussions you had, and I took some notes. And it kind of relates to this. So one point about the prediction thing is you can only make a testable prediction if the data isn't all already in, right?
Yeah.
Like, when they predicted the cosmic microwave background radiation.
Sure, but I don't think
it hadn't been discovered yet, so that they didn't know it existed and they predicted it, which added to the theory. But if we already knew all that existed, then it wouldn't be like, oh, they made a prediction and they were right. It would just be they have an explanation that best fits the data.
Right, but I don't think anything ever has. We don't have all the data on any topic ever, so I don't know. Well, yeah, obviously.
Well, we could have the relevant data for, the theistic ideas, like what new data would come in relevant to the soul existing or God existing?
Anything, novel testable predictions. So it's literally anything we don't know. If you could predict it, that counts as evidence. So for example, if there is a God or something and I can pray to the God and the God will make a gold brick materialize in front of me, poof, it materializes, that would be good evidence of the God. So it's literally any novel testable prediction of anything we don't know. It doesn't need to be specifically relevant to the soul.
You're not one of those God could come down from the sky and proclaim his existence and I still wouldn't believe it. I just think I was hallucinating.
If it was predicted beforehand, then I would believe it. If it wasn't predicted, then it would be just a phenomenon we're trying to explain. So it's about the prediction.
What if it was just HARP and they were just using some fancy technology to make a hologram in the sky?
Well, that's kind of like my example earlier of what knocked over the cup, was it the squirrel or the rat? Like, well, all of the testable predictions indicate squirrel, but we can't prove it with absolute certainty. Maybe it was a rat that knocked it over and the squirrel just came by and left droppings. So there's always, in science, we don't have absolute certainty, but we do have reasonable levels of certainty, like significant levels of certainty. So if, for example, you predicted that Harry Krishna was going to come down from the sky and give gold bricks to everybody, and it happened, then I'd be like, yep, that's evidence of your hypothesis. You got it right. No one else predicted it. You are correct, and we don't have anything. So,
right.
But if, for example, it just happened randomly that some being came down from the sky and gave everyone gold bricks, then it wouldn't be reasonable to conclude your hypothesis because that would just be post hoc. So if you can predict it beforehand, regardless of what it is, that's evidence of your hypothesis. Same as science.
There's a few things predicted in the Bhagavatam. They predicted that the people of this age would be slow, short-minded, and always disturbed.
Well, they got Trump right.
Anyway.
Well, actually, I think one thing I did want to mention is that Hinduism has the most accurate cosmological dates of any religion, saying the Earth was about 4 billion years old, one of the dreams of Brahman. Like, that's the most accurate.
Yeah, it does fit quite well. Yeah, we don't have any problem with. We have a problem with evolution, but I think that the evidence behind evolution is spurious, so that's not a problem for us. But you might disagree.
I have to grant that Hinduism's 4 billion year prediction, that's pretty good. That's a good testable prediction. You have some evidence. I can't be like, no, that counts. You're better than Christianity. Like, okay, 4 billion years, pretty accurate. I'm impressed.
I've got to do some more research on it, but I mentioned this when I was on Aaron Ra's YouTube channel that the Surya Siddhanta has accurate descriptions of the solar system too. It mentions the orbits of the planets to within 0.3% accuracy.
Yeah, that would be pretty good if you could confirm that. I don't think it's true. I've studied it a little bit. I don't think that's confirmed, but if you could, that would be good. Yeah.
And they're like, there was in like the 1800s or something, there was one astronomer who was visiting India because he wanted to witness the solar eclipse that he'd predicted.
Yeah.
Or something like that. And he found this Indian astrologer who could predict the solar eclipse by pushing shells around on a beach. So like the modern mathematical description of the orbit of Mars is 15 pages of digits. That's a lot of precision.
Yeah, that would definitely count it out as for sure.
That's ridiculous. Whereas the Vedic idea is not so accurate. They only get it to 0.3% accuracy, but they have what's called bija values, which is, like you do measurements every 100 or so years and you insert these values into the equations, and that makes it accurate enough for you to do your astrology. And so they were getting accurate predictions, but the amazing thing is they'd simplified it. So the ability to simplify an equation shows a deep understanding of it. The fact that this guy could push shells around on a beach and do the equation shows a high level of sophistication.
Yeah, I mean, I'd count that as a novel testable prediction. If you can say, here is my mathematical calculation of what's occurring, and you can get it right, that's a novel testable prediction. I think he froze. You froze there a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know if it was me or you. Anyway, and maybe I'll produce a video on it. I think it's worth doing.
Yeah, definitely. I would count that as evidence. If you can calculate the movement of the stars or whatever, just using whatever your ideology is and get it right, that's a novel testable prediction. That means if I can predict how this is going to occur in the future, which we don't know yet, and you get it right, that's great evidence. How do you spell Hari Krishna? H-A-R-E?
You want me to put it in the chat?
They're arguing about it in the live chat. So.
There it is.
It's Harry.
I'm on my other YouTube channel. Hang on.
So HAREKRISHNA. Is that correct?
Yeah, there we go. I'll write it from my Now I'm promoting both my YouTube channels in the chat.
Nice. Harry, like Harry Potter.
Like a big rabbit.
Like a big hare, yeah.
There was this one guy who found a Bhagavad Gita in the bushes or something, and he like read the whole thing, was totally convinced, started chanting Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare.
Harry Christians. So I mean, if those examples pan out, then I would count that as evidence. I don't think they will. I've researched it quite a bit. I mean, the 4 billion years is pretty accurate. I count that as decent. That's decent. Yeah. But other than that, I see nothing else has been verified.
We can park that one for another day.
For sure.
Coming back to the original point where we got off on this tangent from, I was talking about how the qualities of the soul, and I was going to make the argument based on the soul having certain qualities that a psychopath or somebody with severe autism is not necessarily exhibiting their natural state. They're in a body which is giving them a conditioned nature, which is unnatural, and that causes them to take pleasure in unusual ways. I mean, like you can take a body as a pig and then you enjoy eating stool. We find that pretty weird.
So how do you tell the difference between it acting as the way it should in its natural state as opposed to an unnatural state? Which ones are the natural state? Which ones are the unnatural states?
Well, I mean, I think mild Asperger's is probably just like a neurological type, like most creative geniuses like Einstein and Nikola Tesla were probably Asperger's. And,
I mean, like if we just compare the vast majority of humanity, why are they considered the natural state as opposed to the people with high functioning autism? Why aren't they considered the natural state? Why is the natural state?
Well, I mean, kind of comes down to a version of idealism or something where there's like a natural state, like the soul has a nature and it enters this body and becomes covered over and takes on a different state. So there's like an original existence, which is the nature of the soul. And I mean, like even in this body, people are born with a particular psychophysical nature. And if, like somebody has a nature for fixing things and they're working in a childhood daycare, right, looking after children, they might be going mad because it's a very different thing looking after children than, fixing electronics or, doing engineering work, and vice versa. If someone has a nature for working with people and caring for people and they're working with machines all day, they'll go mad. So there's a variety of neurological types, and there's a similar thing for the soul, that the soul has a certain nature and it gets happiness in certain ways. And when we're like, one analogy that we often use for it is if you have a car and you don't put petrol in it, or you put petrol in it, you get nice mag wheels, you put neon lights on it, you paint it, polish it, put a nice stereo system in it, but you don't feed the driver, then the driver is not going to be happy. So in a similar way, we have a God-shaped hole in our heart. And if we try to satisfy it with material things, like, it's quite common that rich and famous people will have a kind of depression because they thought that this fame and this wealth and all these, all this attention and material amenities would make them happy, but it didn't. So they're depressed. Like, there's quotes from Mike Tyson who said things like that, and various other examples. There's suicides among them, and George Harrison the Beatles went to India, and one holy man there said, "You're very lucky. Most people spend their whole life trying to get on top of the wall. You're very lucky to have at such a young age gotten to the top of the wall and realized that there was nothing up there for you." So that some of the Beatles were on spiritual journeys. George Peterson had some exposure to the Harry Krishnas. He financed the first printing of the Krishna book.
Sure, but my question is how do you determine what the natural state is? If you assume we have a natural state, why assume that one personality type is the natural state as opposed to the inversion? For example, if in 500 years all human beings just stop believing in God, but we're all happy with just material things or whatever, would that lower your confidence level that your understanding of the natural state is correct? Maybe the natural state is something different than what Hari Krishna says.
Well, even if you had that, you'd still have people who are taking their happiness from something contingent. So, I mean, yeah, hypothetically, if you did have a world where people had a far deeper satisfaction having nothing to do with religion and being fully atheistic, that would challenge the hypothesis. But if you then, conceivably they'd be getting their happiness from having a nice bank balance or, having various other things. And if those things fell apart, then they might become miserable. Whereas the spiritual happiness, when you actually become transcendentally situated, it can't be taken away from you under any circumstance.
Well, I mean, I agree that if you believe in an imaginary friend or whatever, and as long as you don't stop believing in the imaginary friend, then obviously you're going to remain happy. And so since it's not contingent on something in the world which you have no control over, and it's purely based on something in your imagination, obviously you would be able to remain happy for your entire life in those circumstances, because inner peace or whatever, it's literally something inside of yourself that makes you happy.
Yeah.
Whereas opposed to if it's contingent on something in the world, well, then obviously if it changes, then that would be...
Okay, go ask Mummy. Sorry? Is she outside or in the garage? Or... Just call out to her. Sorry.
That's all right.
My 4-year-old.
That's all right.
He's hungry and he doesn't know where Mummy is. Yeah, continue.
Yeah, so I would agree with you that if your source of happiness comes from within your mind, something you imagine, then whatever that thing you imagine is, as long as you're able to imagine it, you will be happy, regardless of whether it's a contingent thing or some kind of necessary being in some kind. So whether it's a real God or an imaginary friend, either way, it's still going to make you happy because it's something you have control over, as opposed to money or whatever, which you don't have control over and it can change at any time. But the happiness there doesn't seem to be the difference. It just seems to be where you get it from. Is it something easy to get or is it something hard to get? If it's something from inside of yourself, well, it's relatively easy to get, as opposed to being, for example, only Ferraris make me happy. Well, that's something very hard to get that you don't have control over. So it doesn't seem to be the happiness that's the difference there. And you mentioned that if it was the case that people were getting more satisfaction from atheistic societies, that would be a challenge to the position. Isn't the fact that that's exactly what's happening all over the world sufficient challenge to the position?
Well, the happiness is hollow. Like, I mean, how happy can you be just like shoving pizza down your gob? You can only eat so much pizza, right?
I challenge that hypothesis, but but as far as I can tell, like from my experience from being both religious and non-religious, I was in less pain non-religious than religious. So there's definitely people who gain more value and happiness from being non-religious than being religious. And they can
Well,
get their source of happiness, again, like Stoics or whatever, from internally as well. It doesn't need to come from a god.
you might want to call this a no true Scotsman's fallacy, but I find that accusation that's often leveled. I find that one dumb though. But I'd say that the religious community or philosophy that you had was probably not the greatest, and you can do better. And that's what I'm exposed to at the moment. Like, I was exposed to Christianity, and I mean, there's nice people there and all that. I don't have any problem with Christians, and there's definitely some nice God-conscious Christians. But we've got a more comprehensive philosophy, and in Auckland, at least, we have a really nice community. And you can chalk the community up thing. Well, you can have an atheistic community too, and that's a fair point. But yeah, I would just say that the kind of happiness that you get from the material things is more hollow. It's like, I mean, the proof is to some extent personal. Like, how much can you say, hold up some, I mean, like, picture it, find a really happy materialist and then a really happy spiritualist. And it's like, well, which one's more happy? It's like, how do you measure it? Like,
exactly. That's kind of my question, is that it seems like you're asserting, well, the religious one is happier. And I'm like, how do you come to that conclusion exactly? Like, how did you measure this?
I mean, one point I like to argue for my theological case is that we have an epistemic faculty. We have an ability to perceive truth. And there's virtue epistemology along with that. So it's contingent on our level of consciousness. Just like, for understanding mathematical proofs, you need to have a minimum level of mathematical acumen. So for perceiving truths about reality, you need to have an elevation of consciousness just sufficient to be able to perceive that. So people who are really degraded in consciousness, they don't see the value in not causing suffering to other people. If it makes me happy, then I don't care who suffers. Whereas when you become a little more elevated, you realize actually it's a good thing to make other people happy while making myself happy. And, if my happiness is someone else's suffering, then it's not actually my happiness. That sucks.
But, right, I would agree with all of that, but I think the humanists agree with you on that, even without a god. So I still don't see your connection.
I mean, I'm saying there's different levels. So I'm giving an example of something that everybody agrees to. Well, and then I'm saying it's conceivable based on this, that at a even higher level of consciousness, you perceive the truth of Krishna consciousness.
Well, again, so I'd say, how do you measure this? How do you see which one is higher and which one is not higher? Because it seems like it's totally, this is my belief system, so I think this one is higher, kind of a thing. But I can say the opposite.
To some extent, it's self-evident. Like, you presumably you have dreams when you sleep at night, right?
Yep, usually
and
nightmares.
Sometimes you might think that the dream is real. So how do you know that your waking life is real and the dream is just a dream?
Novel testable predictions.
Oh, well, your novel testable predictions could just be features of the dream.
Right. We don't have absolute certainty, but it's the same thing as the squirrel and the rat before. If it makes novel testable predictions, that's evidence for the hypothesis you are correct. And so if one of them...
it's an internally consistent idea. And it maps onto your experiences.
Right. I'm not sure. So we need some way to differentiate imagination from reality. Is any hypothesis real or is it imaginary? And the way we do that is we say there's some difference between my imagination and what I'm experiencing. For example, I can't lift my TV up with my imagination, no matter how hard I try. I'd love to use the force, but no force powers. So if I have some kind of explanation of what's going on in reality, then if it predicts something I don't know yet in the future, it's pretty good evidence that that explanation is about reality and not about my imagination. So if I can make novel testable predictions, that's pretty good evidence that what I'm predicting is reality, since I can't control it with my mind.
Conceivably, you could have a dream, and in your dream, you could make predictions and they come true.
Sure, and conceivably we could be in the Matrix, but conceivability isn't actual evidence. It's the testable predictions is. That's where we can...
Well, my solution to this problem is self-evident proof, so that our experience of this world and of other people, the quality of that experience cannot reasonably be explained any other way than that this material world is real and other people are conscious just like me.
So you don't think we could be in the Matrix?
I think that we have an epistemic faculty that can cut through that. And I mean, the Vedic idea is that we are, and this reality is a kind of simulation. It's it's that this world is meant to deliver conscious experiences to living entities, to conscious souls. But it's real in a sense. It's not real in the sense that it's temporary, but it's real in the sense that we are here interacting with other people, and people do suffer and enjoy based on our actions and their actions in this world. So the reality of it is that we're having experiences. But I do think we can we can tell the difference between living in a simulation, that there's that there's a thought experiment about if you could enter a simulation machine, a false reality machine, where you think you're having a reality, you can pre-program all the experiences you could have, but nobody would be conscious. You'd just be in there interacting with the simulation. That you give that argument to people. It's like you could have anything you ever wanted, but it wouldn't be real. Most people say, I wouldn't want that. I want to have a real life. That's kind of unrelated, but it shows how. The point I'm getting at is I think we can tell the difference between something being real and fake. And if we're going to doubt our epistemic faculties to that extent, then we can't have any knowledge of anything.
Well, that's kind of some of the biggest problems in philosophy is like, how do we tell we're not in the matrix? How do we tell we're not in the brain in the vat, or Boltzmann brain, or the only brain in the universe solipsism? Like I don't know what you mean by we can just know intuitively, or we have epistemic faculties that can do this. Like, that's not really. It seems like circular reasoning. I can just know that it's the case. Well, I could just say that about anything. We could just know there's a God, or we could just know there is no God, or we could just know it is the matrix. We could just know it's not the matrix. It works equally as well for any belief system and its negation. So,
well, one way it works is it's you can have increasing levels. So you could be eating green mangoes and think that you're eating ripe mangoes, supposing you'd never eaten a ripe mango. But the first time you have a ripe mango, you'll be like, oh, this is a ripe mango. I've been wasting my life eating green mangoes all this time. Now I know what a ripe mango actually tastes like, and I'm only going to eat ripe mangoes from now on. So in a similar way, you have a dream and you think it's real, but as soon as you wake up, your waking life is more real than your dreaming life. So, and like, it's the same with a logic, right? Like, how do you know a logical argument is true? It's self-evident that the relationship between the premises and the conclusion, when you comprehend the logic, is self-evident. Like, you can't prove 2 + 2 = 4. It's just, we know that it's the case.
So we can actually prove that. There are actual mathematical proofs in the Principia Mathematica that 1 + 1 = 2 and 2 + 2 = 4. And they're actually really long. They're really complicated proofs. It's not like it's not simple and obvious at all. And logical proofs are definitely not obvious. Looking at formal logic is extremely complicated stuff that most people don't get. And there's multiple different kinds of logic, like standard logic, many-valued.
Sorry.
Well, there's kinds of logic that reject the law of identity, law of non-contradiction, and law of excluded middle. So there are many logics you wouldn't necessarily recognize intuitively, like many-valued logic, which has a true, a false, and a both true and false at the same time category. And it works equally as well to describe reality as standard logic. So I don't think what you said really maps onto math or logic, which are just languages. They aren't parts of reality on their own. And we can prove them, but they aren't self-evident. They are not self-evident at all to be true. They're very complicated things. But I still don't think anything is the only thing that's self-evident from my understanding is I think, therefore I am. That's self-evident by necessity. But everything else, not so much.
Well, if it's not self-evident, then all it is internally consistent, and it fits with our experiences.
Sure.
It fits the data.
Sure.
That's all you have then.
Sure. I don't see a problem with
that. So then we can apply that same epistemology to theism. So if I have a theological explanation which is internally consistent and consistent with my experience of reality, what's the problem?
Can it make testable predictions? So
what?
Oh, it's just a one thing is if just the fact that it's consistent isn't good enough, because infinitely many different hypotheses are all internally consistent and can all explain the data. What knocked over the cup? A squirrel, the wind, a meteorite, invisible aliens, magic leprechauns, a god, the wind, somebody bumped the table. There's infinitely many ways to explain what knocked over the cup, which is true of every single phenomenon ever all combined together. There's always going to be infinitely many things. Maybe the universe was created by a leprechaun, 2 leprechauns, 3 leprechauns, whatever. It's called the problem of underdetermination in science. There's always infinitely many ways to explain everything, anything and everything, and they can all explain the data, and they all fit the data. So how do we tell the difference between the two? And that's why we need the novel testable predictions, because if one of the hypotheses can predict the future, that sets it apart from the rest, because every one of them can predict the past, every one of them can explain the past and the present, but only a select few can predict the future. And that's why we have good reason to believe those are true, as opposed to the ones that are just internally consistent and can explain the data.
I mean, regarding the prediction thing, how do I made that point about how, the data could already be in the relevant data. So, with regard to theism, it's conceivable that the proof of God's existence might not be something we find in a test tube or under a microscope or in a telescope. It could be something we find in our conscious experience of the world and our interactions with the world and other people, which is something that the data is available to all people every day. Like when I was little and we did Easter egg hunts, my mum would hide the Easter eggs right out in the open, and we'd be looking under the couch and all sorts of weird places, and it'd just be sitting on the coffee table and we wouldn't find it. So it could be that the data is already available, therefore there's no predictions to be made. We just need to look at what's the best explanation for the data we already have. And I can argue that theism is the best explanation.
I don't understand, because we obviously don't know everything, so there's obviously something you could make a testable prediction about, but I don't know how we could have all of the data. I don't know how that would even be possible.
I mean, the data that is has relevance to the hypothesis. I mean, one prediction would be, that the religious practice works on consciousness. So following the religious practice given in Bhagavad Gita should give a particular result. And if you made a similar practice that had nothing to do with the religion, that was atheistic or whatever, it shouldn't give the same result. So chanting Harry Krishna repeatedly should give a certain benefit, and chanting Coca-Cola repeatedly shouldn't give that same benefit.
Sure, yeah, that would definitely work. We just have to find a replacement that would have the same. It would have to make a prediction outside of the social sciences prediction about cultural relevance. So, for example, if you are Hindu and you chant Harry Krishna, obviously that would likely have some kind of dopamine effect. Just like if you're Christian and chant Jesus, it's going to have a dopamine effect. You see people in churches all the time where some pastor just waves his hand and everybody falls down because they have this shock of dopamine that they didn't expect. But it seems like if it was like just somebody who had no connection to Harry Krishna or no knowledge at all, and they said it and got some change or some demonstrable result, that would be good evidence for sure.
Yeah. I think someone has done a study like that. I'll look into it. What you'd want to do is give people a word that sounded like a Sanskrit word, but wasn't actually Sanskrit, so that people couldn't tell the difference.
Yeah, that would be good.
Although a lot of people probably know Harry Krishna is a bona fide mantra, but you could probably give them something that they equally think is bona fide.
I bet I could find someone who has no idea who that is in 5 minutes just walking down the street.
Yeah.
So another thing I wanted to bring up was free will. You mentioned free will. Now, the consensus is there is no such thing as free will in most fields. Free will seems to be impossible. Like anything you do is either going to be determined by reasons, in which case the reason you did it was what caused the choice, not any kind of free will. Or it was done for no reason, like it was just, you had no reason to do it, it's just I picked it at random or something. And randomly doesn't seem to be free will. So it seems like the only two options you have are it's done for reasons, in which case it's determined, or it's done for no reason, in which case it's random. And neither of those seem to be free will. So how would you respond to that? How do you incorporate free will into your worldview?
I've listened to Stephen M. Barr's audiobook. He talks about this a bit in there.
What's his name?
Ancient Physics and Modern Faith. Stephen M. Barr. Usually when I quote him to atheists, they're like, that guy, what are you doing quoting that guy? He's nonsense. I'm like, I'm just giving him credit for the idea. I'm not quoting him as an authority. Jeez.
Yeah, where are you that guy? He's such a terrible guy. I have no idea who he is.
I don't understand why so many people use ad hominem arguments. But yeah, so based on listening to him, I got the idea that free will is it's neither random nor determined. It's a third category. And that's one definition you could give for free will. The other common definition is the ability to have done otherwise.
Right. And so I'm asking, how is that possible? So from my perspective, if it's a third category, how do you get that third category? Because I'm like, as you mentioned, logic earlier, it's either P or not P. So P is done for reasons, not P is not done for reasons or done for no reasons.
So the causal relationship between the soul and how it exercises free will over our actions in this world is desiring. So we desire some things and we reject other things, but I guess primarily all you're really doing is desiring. So the mind is accepting and rejecting. So you have some experiences and you think I like this, and you have other experiences and you think I don't like that, and it can get more subtle. So as far as obviously the deterministic hypothesis lacks evidence. Like, you can't prove it. The only way to prove it would be able to, study everything about a person's brain and the world they're interacting with, and then with 100% accuracy predict, or with a high level of accuracy, predict the actions they take in the world. And, you can't do that. Like, even with the case where somebody has a brain tumor which causes them to, go around killing. It's like, the brain tumor explains the violent behavior, but the brain tumor doesn't. The tumor doesn't explain why they picked that weapon and killed those people. There's a lot that's still open to question about why it happened in precisely that way.
So what level of accuracy would you need? So for example, we can already do that. We can just look at an fMRI, know what the person's going to pick before they pick it, with 5 seconds ahead, with reasonable high levels of accuracy. And we just discovered this technology, fMRI technology, within the past decade. So we already have.
But can you do that and know what they're going to pick in 30 years?
Once we get to a high enough level of accuracy, yeah.
I guess.
My question is,
if you put a timeline on that, you could say it's a falsifiable hypothesis. But if you just want to say in the future scientists will prove this, it's like, okay, well, that's nice, but what have they done now?
Right. So that's my question: is that what would be the amount that would satisfy you? For example, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. If we can get what they're going to do right 99% of the time, would that be sufficient?
So I would say that, we have a particular mentality at a given moment. And, if you know a person well, it's like there's an argument given against free will that it's like, well, if God can predict your actions, then you don't have free will. It's like, well, you might have somebody who knows you really well, that knows what actions you're going to pick, but their foreknowledge of your decision-making doesn't force you to act that way. You could act differently. So I think, if you know enough about a person, you can predict the way they're going to behave because you know their mentality.
Right. But so I'm saying, like, scientists who've never met you before, they put you in an fMRI, they read your brain, and they can know everything you're going to do, or every choice you're going to make for the next 15 minutes, 99% accuracy. Would that be sufficient to cause you to believe you had probably no free will there?
I don't think that's any different from, say I know my 4-year-old son inside out, and I know if we take him out for dinner what he's going to choose, or if I give him an options of toys to play with, which ones he's going to choose. I think it's just a scientific level of doing something similar, of knowing a person's mentality and predicting their actions. So, and I would say that doesn't bar us having the ability to change our mentality. So, some people are born and they see their parents being abusive to each other and they think, I don't want to do that. I'm going to be different. And some people do that and they just, let's say there seems to be a causal relationship between witnessing and experiencing abuse and becoming abusive yourself. Like, it's definitely correlated.
Yeah, it's actually higher. So if you experience abuse as a child, you're more likely to be an abuser yourself. Yes.
But you get a number of people who experience abuse that are like, no, I'm not going to be like that. And they do all this self-improvement stuff and they change their mentality. So how do you predict which child is going to grow up to do all the self-improvement and which child's just going to fall into the pattern?
Certain kinds of genes that have certain kinds of connections neurologically. There's actually one recently I've been studying related to depression, where there's a specific kind of a gene that if you have it as a child, if you experience negative things, they become exponentially negative emotion. They have an exponential growth of how negative they are for you. Whereas if you don't have this gene, then it's just a standard rate of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever. I forget what it's called, additional, whatever. So if you have this gene, then having repeat negative You were disconnected. No.
I lost you for a sec. Anyway, I heard you and the chances of having repeat.
Yeah, so if there's this gene that if you have this gene and you have repeat negative instances, then the emotional response you have will become exponentially bad. After you have like 5 or so, it'll just be intolerable, and you're more likely to have those kinds of resenting outbursts as a response to them. So if you have this gene, you are more likely to become, like, significantly more likely to become a child abuser in that case, as opposed to someone who gets over it. So we can definitely look at your genes and know what's most likely going to happen based on their brain chemistry. I don't see how you said that if we could look at the brain and know exactly what someone's going to do for the next 15 minutes, you say that's no different from just knowing their personality. I don't quite understand the
it's a higher level of the same thing. Just like I compared the CD to the thing where you turn the wheel and you get the noise on the little prongs.
So like
it's just a more sophisticated version of the same thing, is what I'm saying.
So just using your God example, if God knows everything you're going to do, and if we rolled back the clock and there's no way you could have done otherwise, is that still free will?
Well, if you couldn't have done otherwise, then it's not free will. Free will is the ability to do otherwise.
That's right. So if God
I'm not sure if God does know everything we're going to do or not. I'm not sure what the verdict on that is based on our theology.
All right, this is just hypothetical. So hypothetically, if God knew everything we were going to do, and there was no way to escape God's premonition, then we would not have free will, right?
God knowing what choices we're going to make doesn't mean we're not making a choice with our own volition. It just means he knows us so well that he can predict.
So remember, if we couldn't go back and do otherwise, we don't have free will, right?
So, to me, free will is that we're choosing the experiences we want to have. I want to go away from things that cause that experience, and I want to go towards things that cause that experience. So if the causal factor, or if not the only cause, there's other causes, but if one of the primary causal factors is my decision to move towards certain experiences and away from others, then that's free will. I'm making a conscious choice, and different people have different desires, and some people will get exhausted with a particular thing quicker than others.
Right. So I like chocolate ice cream, you like vanilla ice cream. We go to the ice cream store, I buy chocolate, you buy vanilla. Obviously. But going based off of the other definition, the definition of being able to do otherwise. So if we roll back the clock just infinitely many times, God knows the choice we're going to make every single time. It's the same choice. That would mean we don't have free will, right?
No, because the causal element is still our choosing to have certain experiences. That's still the factor that's making the decision. God's foreknowledge isn't determining the action. He's just aware of the action.
So it's not the ability to do otherwise. It's the ability to make a choice.
I did find that decision quite weird. The ability to do otherwise given a slight change in our desiring.
Okay, so that seems to be
like if everything was identical, obviously the same thing would happen. But if the soul is a little bit more exhausted with that activity, or a little bit more pining for another activity, then if you don't change one element, you're not going to get a different outcome.
Right.
You've got to have something changed, and so if something changed, for it to be based on free will, it would be the soul's desiring, and God could be aware of that too.
Right. I'd say that would be exactly consistent with determinism. What we say is that your actions are determined by your brain state, and if you wanted to change it, you'd have to change some feature of your brain state. Your desire would just be a neurochemical response. But yeah, essentially the same thing. So I think that's called compatibilism, is what that position is.
Well, that takes agency away, right?
Yes.
Well, you have the illusion of agency.
Right. So in neurology, we consider your free will to be just simply your brain state, whereas in your case, you believe it's a soul thing. But based on the definition you gave, I don't think that would qualify as free will, like the libertarian free will that Christians would like to think of, that you could have done otherwise. That seems to be just you're doing what you're determined to do by either your soul's desires or by your brain's desires. And you couldn't have really done otherwise because it's determined by those desires.
I think using the word determinism here is a bit out of place, because you're applying determinism to the soul choosing. So if the soul makes a free will conscious decision, you're now calling that determinism.
Well, you said the soul's choice was based on its desires, right?
And the desires are a feature of the soul.
Right. So I'm saying that if your choice is determined by the desires, then it would be the same as if your choice was determined by neurons. What's the difference between those two cases?
Well, one's material and one's metaphysical.
What difference does that make?
Well,
it's like, for example, I could make a chair out of wood or glass or plastic or metal, but it's still a chair either way. So, for example, if you wanted to call this free will, if your choice is influenced by your desires, well, then couldn't I just call my choice that's influenced by my neurons equally as free as the soul version that you're espousing?
Well, the neurons aren't something you have control over, and they can be tinkered with.
Do I have control over my desires?
Yeah. I mean, like, the problem I have with your use of the word determinism here is, when you have a cause and an effect, you can use the word determined. But generally, the way the word determined is used is as a alternative to free will existing. So, there's determinism, chance, and free will.
Well, right. So I'm not trying to focus.
Free will and my ontology is determining.
Floating head. Well, yeah. So my goal here isn't to focus.
You're on YouTube.
Wave.
Wave to all the people on YouTube.
Like, run away. So my goal here isn't to focus on determinism. My goal here is to compare the two. Like, my belief system is that you have desires, and those desires are influenced by your brain state. And then the choices you make are going to be influenced by those brain states. And you're saying they're influenced by these supernatural desires. But I don't see any difference between these two ideologies. It doesn't matter what you call them right now. Determinism, free will, it doesn't make a difference. It seems like, just like you believe that your desires, which are supernatural, affect your choice, I believe the desires, which are natural, affect the choice. And if you want to call that free will, it doesn't seem like your free will is any different from what I call determinism. It seems like they have the same features as one another. I don't see there's any difference there. One just happens to be supernatural, one just happens to be natural.
Well, I mean, one difference would be that if you took the soul and put it through a conscious experience in a body, and then repeated it and put it through the identical conscious experience in an identical body, identical world, and you did that repeatedly, the soul would grow tired and make different decisions. I guess I'm kind of doing a Groundhog Day thought experience, because the soul has, is the one perceiving, and it has we have the material mind, but there's also there's a spiritual aspect of that, the intellect, which is carried from body to body, and the soul gets exhausted from certain activities, or gets satiated and says, I've had enough of this. There's got to be something more. I want something deeper. I want a deeper satisfaction. Or, I'm sick of this. I want to try some other materialistic pleasure. So that would be one of the differences.
Well, how would that be different from your Groundhog Day example? If he can go back in time and he just remembers it through neurological states and without a soul, and he would be able to make he'd get tired of the same things. Wouldn't that also count as free will by your definition? If he was just material, and the material part got reset.
To extend the thought experiment to fit your point, we would have the homunculus, right? The little man inside the brain. And let's say the little man inside the brain lives for 1,000 lives, but he still has a material body. And, he's tiny, and, when this body dies, he gets taken out and put into a new body. And he's still material, still got a neurology just like ours, but it's miniature. And, he's sitting in there watching the TV and thinks he's the body and so on. Then he would get exhausted and make different decisions because he has a layer of conscious memory. It's not like it's a memory, but it's like the Sanskrit word is samskaras, which means impressions. Then you can have a scar, you don't remember the injury happening, but the scar is still left behind. So our consciousness has impressions from our past experiences. So the homunculus can carry these experiences from lifetime to lifetime. The problem I have with that example is it's basically what's the word? It's indistinguishable from my hypothesis of the soul. So, if we did have something like that, it would basically make more sense to call it a soul. And even if it only lived 100 lifetimes and then died, then obviously that would be a different ontology. But how would you know that?
Well, right. So I'm not saying the homunculus example. I'm saying just if there was just a brain and nothing else, and every time the brain went through this like iteration, just like imagine Bill Murray going through Groundhog Day, and instead of actually being able to remember everything, there was just some kind of subtle subconscious shift where there was a brain state change. You just wasn't aware of it consciously. That seems to be the same as your example, and it would also qualify as free will by your definition because it meets all the criteria you've outlined, even though it's just determinism in the brain. I don't see the difference between the two hypotheses. So just imagine like Bill Murray going back in time, and the only change is that there's some subconscious difference in his brain that he's just unaware of. And eventually the subconscious difference is going to build up enough where he's going to make a different decision than previously.
I think the other problem we're having is the nature of consciousness. So when you describe, our decision-making process as being determined by the brain, you're basically giving an alternative hypothesis for the conscious experiencer. So, we're talking about the same reality, that in both cases we have a consciousness which is having the, appearing to make decisions based on desiring. The problem is, it comes down to consciousness. So if consciousness is produced by the brain, then you have determinism. It's determined by physical processes. And then you have the illusion of free will.
Right.
If consciousness exists separate from the body, then the consciousness has a role to play in our decision-making process, the soul.
Right. So I'm just granting both of them could be true, like two worlds, one where your hypothesis is true and one where my hypothesis is true. And we're saying you have this thing you define as free will. And you've listed a set of criteria that qualifies what free will is. And I'm saying, well, this world, which is purely deterministic, seems to have all those same properties. So even if we grant your hypothesis is true in your world and my hypothesis is true in my world, it seems like by your definition of free will, the determinist has equally as much free will as you do in your soul world. So I don't see how that's where the question is. What is the difference between these two? Because it seems like all of the things that you're describing can be achieved in a purely deterministic world just by having someone go back and having some subconscious brain state change.
Again, I think it comes down to the soul. So they seem to have the same qualities simply because you've taken the same phenomenon. So we're both talking about the same phenomenon. That's why they seem to have the same qualities. So the question is which explanation better fits the data? And the key thing we need to explain here is the desiring. So can you reasonably explain our conscious experience? Like I enjoy, like let's say people like going for a run, and some people that, they love physical exercise and they don't mind the suffering that comes with it, the aches and pains in the body. They just get more pleasure from it. And other people, they go for a run and the suffering in their body outweighs the pleasure that they get from it, let's say. So how do you explain the conscious experience that some people prefer one experience over another? When really what it comes down to is how do you explain consciousness having experiences of qualia and then moving towards some and away from others?
I don't think so, because my argument here is that we just grant you're right. Just say you are absolutely 100% right. Here is a universe where everything you're saying is 100% true. And we also grant I'm right. Here's a second universe where everything I'm saying is 100% true. And they have all the same properties. You say free will is the ability to do otherwise, because if you do the same thing multiple times, the soul is going to have some kind of a desire shift. It's going to get tired of something. And I'm saying, well, that seems to be happening in this deterministic world where I'm right. This person's going back in time and there's a subconscious shift in their brain state, and their subconscious shift is making them tired of this one thing or whatever. And by your definition, that seems to fit all of the criteria you require of free will, other than instead of it being a soul, it's a natural getting tired of rather than a soul getting tired of. So just based on your definition of free will, it seems like that definition could be equally applied to a purely naturalistic state. That is, I think, that we would both call determined in some way.
I mean, I'd say provided you can explain how the brain can produce consciousness, then we're in competition. Like really, I think it boils down to consciousness. So the determinism that you're talking about is at the deepest level, it's produced by chemicals interacting with one another. And below that, it's quarks and so on. So, it's that we have this illusion of making conscious decisions, but really what's going on is chemicals are smashing up against one another, and some of them binding, and some of them whatever reactions are happening, and that's what's causing the decision-making process. And I mean, I think you get one problem with that it violently violates our intuitions. This idea that our decision-making process is determined by chemicals smashing around rather than us choosing to move towards certain things and away from others.
Why is it contradicting our intuitions a problem?
Well, again, it comes back to my epistemology about self-evident proofs, our ability to apprehend reality. So the way I justify using self-evidence as an epistemology is in the absence of a defeater. So, like, I mean, you gave that example of how, some things like, mathematical proofs are really complicated. And when you understand them, you can see that something that's intuitively true is false or whatnot. But that still doesn't disprove our ability to apprehend truths. It just shows that in order to understand things deeper, you got to spend more time with them and manipulate them a bit more and, learn from somebody else. And then you come to a deeper understanding. But there's still a truth apprehending faculty that we have inside of us, which is interacting with reality and growing and learning. So
wouldn't the unreliability of our intuitions be a defeater for any argument from intuition?
I'll pull up a quote from Stephen M. Barr from his book, which is very much related to this. So Stephen M. Barr talks about how when science has shown our intuitions to be false, it's done so by showing that they still have some truth to them. So here's the quote. First of all, the most obvious statements found to be false by science were not simply based on illusion in the sense of something being seen that was not there. Consider Gould's example of the motion of the Earth. Everyone knew, including Galileo's scientific opponents, and the head of the Roman Inquisition, that one's own motion can cause the apparent motion of other objects. He gives a few other examples, like Newtonian physics is intuitive, but it's not that it's false. It's not that the theory of relativity proved that our intuitions about physics are false. It just proves that there are approximations that accurately describe the movement of bodies, with less precision and at lower speeds. And then you need general relativity to describe things approaching the speed of light. And he gives a third example about infinites, that the existence of the same is true of our mathematical intuitions. For example, we intuitively feel that a group of objects will have fewer things remaining in it if we take some of them away. However, it turns out that this is not always so. Specifically, it is not always so of infinite sets of objects, as was shown by the brilliant mathematician George Cantor about a century ago. But again, our intuitions about numbers was not just mistaken. It was a genuine mathematical insight. We would be wrong if we jumped to the conclusion that what was true in a familiar setting would also be true in the bizarre realm of infinite numbers, of which we have no experience in everyday life.
I'm not sure I'm following your point there. So we can show intuitions are false a lot. Like, I have an intuition that this is a solid object, but we've discovered it's actually 99% empty space between the nucleus and the electrons. If you touch a metal object and a plastic object in a cold room, the metal object will feel colder because just the way your skin works, it intuitively feels as if it's colder, even though they're the exact same temperature. We intuitively see hundreds of different kinds of illusions, delusions, fallacies, biases. Every single fallacy, every single bias is a product of human bad intuition.
But both of those examples would fit what Stephen M. Barr was saying, that our intuitions, so what he said it here, we would be wrong if we jumped to the conclusion that what was true in a familiar setting would be true in the bizarre realm of infinite numbers. Or
well, doesn't that just mean it's false? The familiar setting, if it's true in the familiar setting, it just means it's true to our intuition. But if it
means if you extrapolate too much beyond your intuition, you can be wrong. So if you look at the sun orbiting the Earth, there's the phenomenological experience of the sun orbiting the Earth. But that doesn't, if you extrapolate to that, the idea that we're stationary and the sun is the one's moving, you could be mistaken.
Right. So if it's that would be a defeater for applying intuition too, I forget the phrasing you used, too far out or something.
Well, we have an intuition that, the water bottle, like the metal thing, like the metal object is conducting more heat out of your hand when you touch it. That's why it feels colder. It
Right.
is making you colder. When you touch the plastic object, although it's the same temperature, it's not taking your heat away because it's an insulator.
Right.
So there's a reality to that intuition.
So we have a perception, an intuition of our model of reality, and that is useful to us even if it's false. For example, we can have an intuition that objects are solid even when they're not. It's just false that they're solid. Or we can have an intuition that that square has a different color on the top and the bottom, but actually they're the exact same color. They're reflecting the exact same light. Every illusion, every hallucination, every delusion, those are intuitions that we can prove are false, but they have a useful application to them. Type 1 and type 2 errors. If you hear a rustle in the bushes, you think it's a lion, you run away and you survive. If you don't think it's a lion, you get eaten by the lion. And so the people who thought it was a lion survived. And so now every time we hear a rustle in the bushes, we think it's some kind of a mind just because it's beneficial to survival, even though it's obviously false most of the time. But so we know those things are true in context of survival, but not true in the context of reality. So intuitions are useful fictions, and we can treat them as useful fictions, but they're not true. They're just false, but useful. So it's like you said before, it would be wrong to apply intuition to some higher degree than it should be. You can't extend intuition to the, I forget what the word, extreme, unusual, whatever. And when we are talking about reality itself, that would be one of the extreme, unusual things where we cannot apply intuition. Intuition is perfectly reasonable to apply to our everyday lives, to how we perceive the world, to our models of reality. But it seems like one of those cases where we definitely have defeaters for intuition is when we're trying to apply it to the fundamental nature of reality. That's where intuitions just are not applicable. It's one of those extreme, unusual things that we can't use intuition to discover.
Yeah, I mean, when I say intuition, I'm not talking about like, oh, I've got a feeling, I don't trust this person, or, I'm going to bet on these numbers, and I'm not talking about that kind of like the way it's colloquially used. I'm talking about an ability to apprehend truths about reality. So when I wake up from a dream and I say, oh, that was a bad dream, and now I'm back in my real life, that's kind of what I'm talking about. This ability to differentiate, one thing's more real from another. So when you eat ripe mangoes, you know that you're eating ripe mangoes, or when you eat a healthy meal, you know that that meal gave you nutrition.
Well, I mean, I think all of those things fit into the same category. I don't see how those would be different from just illusions, because there could always be just a more ripe mango that we just haven't discovered yet. Or there could be another reality beyond ours that's even more real than this one. The fact
that's one of my claims, actually. that there could be another reality beyond this one that when we elevate our consciousness we'll perceive.
Right. So the question is that why do you think we should be able to trust that method when it may not be?
We should, at any given time, we should trust our deepest perception of reality. So whatever's like most blindingly true to us at a given moment, we should trust. And one reason I like this epistemology is because it's kind of I call it a decentralized safety net against religious fanaticism. Because if everybody is at all time just working based on what they know in their heart to be true, then you're not going to get everybody drinking the Kool-Aid or jumping off bridges because their religious pastor told them to.
Well, isn't that literally what that is? Is that their most deeply held beliefs are this pastor is right, so if he tells us to jump off the bridge, we jump off the bridge? Isn't that literally what you're advocating for?
I think. No, I mean, I've been in a religious organization for like 10 years now, and I've seen how people can deny what they know in their heart to be true because a spiritual leader told them something. And it's like, so they it's like an intellectual conviction. So they have this intellectual conviction that, like they've decided it's like a belief. It's like the difference between belief and knowledge. So like, I know in my heart that I need to raise my kids well. So if, a religious leader tells me your kids aren't important, just focus on your spiritual life. It's like, yeah, no, I'm going to look after my kids.
Speaking of,
right on cue.
So I don't see a way to differentiate between the things we know in our heart is true and the intellectual beliefs. That seems kind of arbitrary. Like, because many people, one of the main arguments against let me know when you're ready. I'm cool.
Yeah, you can go. Yeah.
All right. So yeah, one of the main arguments against the epistemology you're arguing for is the properly basic beliefs, is that for people who believe in voodoo, that is something that is ingrained in them as one of the most fundamental beliefs of reality. They think that voodoo is the fundamental nature of reality, something that's true to them in their hearts. And that doesn't seem to be any fundamentally different than creationists who think the world is 6,000 years old or whatever, because it's so ingrained in their belief system. They were brought up with it as a child, that it to them is one of those beliefs. So I don't see any difference between this know in your heart is true and these taught belief systems, like the pastor says do it, so do it. Those seem to be the same.
Well, I mean, the difference would be, like the ripe mango analogy, like provided people don't have philosophical like biases against certain things being true, like cognitive dissonance can stop people from perceiving truth. So you can give somebody something which is obviously true, and if their cognitive dissonance is too strong, they just won't accept it. So, like say a spiritual leader tells them something, and they love this person, they believe this person's a spiritual guru, and there's a conflict between what this person's telling them and what they know in their heart. They might choose to go with one and not the other. So I would say that this cognitive dissonance can create a problem, and if you put into the ideology this idea that you should trust your heart, then cognitive dissonance is less. And I would trust people's hearts more than I would trust a scientist to tell everybody what to do, or a religious leader to tell everyone what to do. I think in any case, when you get people to shut down their own internal truth compass and just listen to some authority, you're in trouble.
Well, I definitely disagree with that. I'd say that do what the scientists say is usually the best option. But how do you tell that
how does that stop us from having a scientific autocracy where the scientists just become the new religious leaders and the tyrannical leaders just tell the scientists what to tell everybody?
Well, that would be the same. So the goal would be we do what the scientists say because reality tells us to do so. So if it's what the scientists are saying, it should have some kind of demonstrable proof in reality, independent of opinion, which is kind of.
But how do we know that the scientists are right? How do we know they're not just like the new clergy telling everybody what to believe?
Because if it's a demonstrable fact that people can test in reality, then we can verify it's true independent of the scientists.
But then we're using our epistemic faculties to decide who to trust.
Well, we're determining which reliable demonstration of reality, and we're trusting reality. So, I mean, it's not our epistemic faculties, it's reality that we're trusting. But I had a question.
I think you might be misunderstanding what I mean by epistemic faculties based on what you just said.
I was going with the trust in our heart kind of a thingy.
Well, I mean, it's a combination. It's not just like a feeling, like, oh, this feels true. It's also like the laws of logic. Like when you hear a logical, like, you might think that you have a good logical conclusion, but just like with the ripe mango thing, when you eat a ripe mango, you know that this is a ripe mango. When you hear an issue with your logic and someone clarifies, actually, this is what the logic proves, you're missing a premise or you're missing a connection, then you're like, then you realize, oh, I was wrong before and now I'm right. And that's a self-evident perception of the truth.
Yeah, I think you're trying to make a distinction that I don't really see. Like, for example, the mango one is purely emotional. It would be like just what I would see as equivalent to listening to what your heart says, essentially. And the science one would be a different faculty altogether. I don't see those as the same thing. It would be like we know enough about the brain to know that if you're making a decision, if I presented you with a logical argument, but it contradicted your deeply held worldviews, you'd reject the logic. No matter how good it is, it wouldn't make a difference. Flat earthers do that all the time. So it seems
but that's a handicap to my epistemic faculties. It doesn't show that the epistemic faculties don't work. It just shows that they can not work under certain circumstances.
Well, I would say this is the standard for human psychology, is that your emotionally most held beliefs are always going to supersede any logic no matter what. I think that's been proven demonstrably in psychology many, many times over.
Yeah, I mean, that's cognitive dissonance.
Right. I think it's just the standard in humanity. I think that is the heart, going with what your heart is cognitive dissonance. I think literally, I think those are the same thing.
That's not what I mean by the word. I think we need to bring in virtue epistemology. So virtue epistemology means in order to acquire knowledge, you need to have certain virtues. So if you want to be a scientist, you need to work hard and study and listen and be open-minded and, be logical and so on. So in a similar way, there's certain qualities which can impede our ability to understand truths about reality and other qualities which accelerate it. And some of them can impede it to such an extent. Like, I mean, you get super intelligent scientists who are super religious, and you get the same who are not religious at all and are anti-religious. So
yeah, I think I just have to clear up what you mean by listening to your heart, have a more formal definition of that. But we've got a few questions for you, if you don't mind.
Sure.
If karma affects the soul hand because based on actions of the body glove, and yet we know damaging the body directly affects the actions of the hand, how does that influence the soul, which is separate?
So the soul is not affected at all. The soul cannot be burned by fire or slain with a sword or anything. It's smaller than an atom. It doesn't even make sense to give it a measurement because it doesn't exist in a material sense. What's happening when manipulating the brain is affecting the consciousness, or our interaction with this world, is just like like I'm on this call right now. And if my internet failed, I'd be gone from this call. That doesn't mean that the internet connection is causing me to exist, and I stop existing when the call drops off. So, extending on that analogy, when you manipulate the brain, it's just like putting a covering over a light. Different kind of light comes out. So, the person whose brain gets manipulated, like a botched surgery, or they get a tumor or a head injury, that's also their karma. They've done something in this life or in a past life, and there's some reason why the experiences they go through as a result of that are warranted or are intended in order to elevate their consciousness or teach them certain experiences.
So Justin Maurer asks, I'd like him to clarify, does he believe that nothing the body does can affect the soul? If so, what is the practice for?
Well, the soul can suffer so the soul is not harmed, but the impressions on the consciousness of the soul are carried from body to body. So what we take if our consciousness is elevated or degraded, or in the exact ways in which that happens, that the body is affected in that way. So, if we have lots of, you get those stories of kids who remember their past lives, and a lot of them are traumatic deaths. They'll remember, jumping out of the sky tower or something horrific like that. So these impressions can be carried with the soul into the next body.
So he's saying, John Pelosi asks, what other lives? Who is teaching the soul about these other lives? How do you learn about them?
Well, we learn about them by accepting the authority of the scriptures that we accept. So that's a very satisfying answer for skeptics.
Well, that's actually perfectly reasonable. So if I accepted certain scriptures, I could then learn about past lives, kind of a thing? That's a testable prediction?
Yeah, it's fully consistent with science, because in science, it's like, how do you know an atom exists? Like, I read it in the textbook.
Novel testable predictions. That's how.
Okay, but have you done the testing yourself, or you've just taken somebody else's word for it?
Yeah, anybody can do them. So it's, for example, you don't need to make a testable prediction about the atom itself. You can make a testable prediction about the combination of atoms. So, for example, if I throw a baseball at somebody, it'll hurt or whatever. Any novel testable prediction would work. It doesn't necessarily have to be about the atom itself. Same with like God.
Well, that doesn't prove electrons and quarks and up quarks and down quarks and neutrinos.
That does. That's exactly what it does. So just like my example of if I prayed to God and God produced a gold brick, that wouldn't be proof of the God. Obviously aliens could have done it or whatever, but because it can predict these new things we don't know yet with a high level of accuracy, that is evidence of the hypothesis is true. So even if we don't have to prove gluons and protons, all we have to do is show if this hypothesis is true, then here's something we can predict in the real world without having to look at the gluons individually.
Right. So if Krishna consciousness is true, then people who practice it will become blissful, become detached from the material world, and perceive, the real ripe mangoes.
All right, and so if we can do that with a different,
the pudding is in the tasting,
right? So
it's a subjective thing for the person who has the experience.
So if we could accomplish that with a different ideology, would that be evidence the other ideology is true also, or?
Well, we hold to a version of inclusivism, or perennialism, that the spiritual knowledge is delivered to many cultures at many times, but some cultures get an abridged version, and some cultures give a roundabout version. So of course,
So if they had
I
like a
believe that the one I'm
contradictory,
practicing is the comprehensive knowledge with the most direct path. But then, Buddhists, they're worshiping something impersonal. But we believe that impersonal thing they're worshiping does exist, but that there's a higher reality beyond it. So there is an impersonal, warm, fuzzy effulgence which you can merge with, but it's not eternal, and there's a higher state beyond that. So we don't think that these other religions are necessarily like completely false. We just think that they're missing some of the details.
so my question is, if they could do this also, and they had a contradictory worldview, would that be evidence of their hypothesis instead of yours?
Well, our theology would allow for people to not believe in our theology and still get results. They wouldn't get, the highest result, but they get some results. So them getting results doesn't show that their worldview is true. It just shows.
Wouldn't that
there's
also
an
apply to
element of
yours?
truth to it.
Even if yours made the Tesla predictions, it wouldn't show it was true for the same reason?
Well, you've got that elevating levels of proof thing. So, if you get like several Christians and Muslims and Buddhists all coming to Krishna consciousness and saying, "Oh, what I had there was great, but this is better," then that would, just like you wake up from a dream and you think this is more real, and then suppose you woke up and found that this was actually a dream, although more real than your other dreams. You woke up to something even more real, and that could go on to a few layers. So, you could wake up and figure out there's some truth to Buddhism, and then you could wake up and figure out, oh, there's some truth to Christianity, and then you wake up and say, oh no, Krishna consciousness, this is the real one.
So what about converts away from Harry Krishna?
They're just not doing it right.
Okay. Well, Matt Metro asks, how does someone determine what someone else's heart is saying? Is it possible for someone else's heart to be lie or be deceived?
How do we know what someone else's heart is saying?
Yeah, how do you know? You mentioned the distinction between what's true to their heart or what they know in their heart versus what is like a pastor is saying or whatever. How do we know?
I mean, I'm pretty sure all mothers know that their job is to raise their children well. And so if a pastor manages to convince their mum they should kill their child, that pastor has convinced them intellectually to reject what's in their heart.
Right. So how do we determine what are the things in their heart? We just know it intuitively? Is that kind of the thing?
We know it intuitively. I mean, you can see cognitive dissonance in action. I mean, you I haven't really meditated on this much, but you can see when somebody's having a conflict, my guru is telling me to do this, but I don't know if it's the right thing for me to do, but he's my guru, so I should listen to him. Okay. You can see when it's happening on the mental platform, and there's not really a strong conviction that I know what he's I mean, this is sort of an in-house thing, but when I'm anti-religious fanaticism. And when I see people being fanatics, I'll coach them when your guru gives an instruction that is good for you, that there's a different experience. It's I know, I might not want to do this, when somebody goes to a personal trainer and they want to be a professional athlete, it's you're going to have to work your butt off. It's you don't like that instruction, but you know that it's good for you and it's true. If you want to get the result that you're being promised, you're going to have to follow what they're saying. So we can have this conviction, we can have this experience that when the guru gives an instruction, we know that he's telling us something we should follow that's ultimately for our betterment. And, alternatively, we can know when it's yeah, I don't really see how it's true, but anyway, he's my guru, so I better do it.
All right, so Charles in Solo asks, I'm convinced, his heart is convinced him that he's married a soul-sucking demon. How can be certain that is from his heart and not a false belief?
I mean, it's possible for somebody to have a psychosis and think crazy things. I imagine he's just doing a parody.
Yeah.
Argument there, and that's not actually what he thinks. I should hope so anyway.
Hope so. Can't be certain on that one. Give it a 50-50.
But it is possible for people to, have psychosis and misunderstand reality, but that doesn't mean that other people
his question
it's a
serious question is, how did you tell this particular belief would be true or false? What is your criteria?
Okay, well, for the person who's having the psychosis, if they could tell, they wouldn't be having psychosis, would they? Mm-hmm. But from the outside, there's features that you see when a person is, and in mental health, they can look for people that have mental illness. That there's characteristic there's concomitant things that go along with having bad mental health, like they have problems in their personal relationships, they can't keep a job, or I mean, I don't work in mental health, I don't know all the details, but there's signs that a person is mentally unwell. And so I imagine if somebody believes that they're married a soul-sucking demon, and all attempts at exorcism have failed, it's like, well, the chances are that that person's probably having trouble in their interpersonal relationships and might have other markers of mental health problems, in which case you would question their ability to apprehend truth or to perceive reality. But alternatively, when we look at religion, we find highly intelligent people who have high quality interpersonal relationships. They have strong relationships with their kids and their spouse, and lots of good connections in the world, and hold down a job and do great intellectual work. So we can't really question these people's mental health.
Makes me think of Kent Hovind. But that's all the questions we have. So I think that's a good place to.
Much.
What?
I've never listened to much Kent Hovind. I can bring myself to.
Oh, it's just because you talk about healthy relationships and hold down a job. It's like the exact opposite for him. But it was just a joke. So.
Okay.
Yeah, that was it for the questions. Thanks for coming on. It was a really interesting conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me.
I enjoyed that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's nice having an actual intelligent conversation based on philosophy and evidence and stuff, not just an allergy to the idea that I could offer an epistemology for my beliefs.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, thanks. I'm gonna get prepared because I have another debate coming up, so I gotta get going. So it was great talking with you. I'd love to talk with you again sometime. And
okay, cool. Thanks.
Head out. See ya.